For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. I'm at the Brenthurst Foundation in Parktown North to speak with Greg Mills about his latest book, Why States Recover. Several books have been written on why nations fail or why Africa is poor, including your own book on the topic. Your new book, however, seeks answers as to why states recover. What has your research shown? Which states can be said to have been recovered, and how do states recover?
Much of my career in the last 10 years has been spent working in countries which have undergone situations of failure, with some entire countries, other parts of countries. And because of that, I really wanted to document these experiences working as a government advisor across African environments and also in places like Afghanistan. The book is really divided into three parts. There's a sort of countries which are undergoing failure, or parts of them undergoing situations of failure, those which have experienced dramatic interventions. Now, there can be aid interventions, there can be military interventions, and there's a situation related to recovery, and it's different types of recovery. There are those at the top end of the income spectrum, countries like Singapore, let's say, even Vietnam, which has undergone in the last 30 years considerable recovery, Somaliland, which is still desperately poor, but nonetheless is stable, unlike Somalia. They've had an internal process of peace building. South Africa also has recovered compared to where we were 25 years ago. We've moved enormously far, and we have some very interesting lessons when it comes to conflict resolution. So the book is not just a lesson about one thing, it's a lesson about the situations that different types of states across different continents find themselves in, whether it relates to conflict resolution, whether it relates to economic development, developing democracy, and so on.
States can fail in a variety of different and specific ways. Would you please discuss your juxtaposition of state failure in countries like Somalia and Malawi?
In fact, the book goes into different types of state failure, and I see failure very much as a continuum, a spectrum, as it were, that you can have bits of excellence living side by side with situations of failure, which you do, say, and have in a country like Kenya, for example. Even in South Africa, you have this juxtaposition of first world and third world. But the book advances this notion of it's not just Somali-type failure that we have in so-called fragile states or failed states, where you see dramatic collapse and the collapse of government services at large, endemic conflict and warfare, for example. It's also where you have the failure of the state's responsibility towards its own citizens to actually discharge its democratic responsibility in many cases. And that is more of the situation of a country like Malawi, where the government doesn't actually deliver what it's supposed to do. It doesn't deliver what it promises to do. And in fact, the subtitle of the book is about from walking nations to winning societies. And the term walking nations came about from a conversation I had with a Malawian government advisor as we were driving down to the lake one day. And you see many people walking seemingly in the middle of nowhere. And he said, this is the problem with Malawi. We're a walking society. We're walking from one place to another. Everything happens at that pace. We need to transform ourselves in a different way. What they also need to transform is the very nature of their political economy, which is very skewed against competitive business. It's very much a closed shop. It's very much a middleman type of economy. So that's the second type of failure. And then there's a third, perhaps most interesting type of failure, which is what I call authoritarian democracies, the emergence of authoritarian democracies, or democratic failure, where you have countries which have on paper democracies, but they behave in electoral terms like democracies, but they don't behave in terms of discharging the real substance of democracy with regard to democratic participation by its citizenry. And that's important because democracies, the evidence shows quite clearly today, do much better than authoritarian countries when it comes to economic growth and development performance, and for much longer periods of time. The longer that they are democracies for, the better they do. And people often in Africa go, oh, what we'd really like is is some sort of benign dictatorship, some sort of authoritarian state which will really get things done. Well, the record shows in Africa, in fact, they don't get things done, and they grow at much lower rates than, for example, democracies do. They tend to be much more involved in conflict as well. So the whole notion that somehow a big man or big woman will get things done is absolutely wrong when it comes to Africa. And there's a final point here, which is in Asia, which has not had, by any manner of means, in every case, perfect democracies. There's been a lot of authoritarianism as well. There's still a commitment to popular welfare. So while the system of government may not be perfectly democratic, underneath that there's a commitment to popular welfare which ensures that things work much better than in many African examples as well.
Do state recoveries also take place in different ways? What policies can be put into place to encourage state recovery by locals and outsiders?
Well, obviously you're dealing with different types of countries along the spectrum of failure. Let's take, for example, in Afghanistan, where there's widespread insecurity, or Somalia would also fall into that category. Now there, just providing security can make a very big difference. It is the door through which development and economic growth and better governance can follow. You can't have development and economic growth and get better governance without security. Security is not by itself enough to ensure that you have those things, but it's a necessary condition. So it provides a window of opportunity. So the first thing I think one has to do in these circumstances is ensure that local level security, ensure the rule of law is maintained in these environments. And that's much easier, of course, said than done. Look at Somalia. Many years of investment by outsiders, first the Americans, and now, of course, the East Africans, Uganda, Djibouti, Burundi, and Kenya, among them, are trying desperately to impart a degree of security on Somalia. And that's very difficult if the locals don't want it. And that's perhaps the most important lesson of all, is you need to have local ownership of the problem as much as you have of the solution. And once you have local ownership, and there's a degree of local buy-in to the political solution, and then the development and governance solutions that follow, things become much easier. And I think that's the lesson that you learn out of Afghanistan, of 13 years of international involvement in Afghanistan. If parts of Afghanistan, certainly the southern parts of Afghanistan, the Pashto-dominated parts, don't want the government in Kabul to rule them in a particular way, or the international community, then it's always going to be hugely problematic in bringing stability to those areas. As you move further up that spectrum towards those countries which perhaps have basic security but need economic diversification and the like, then there's other lessons that can be learned. This is a well-trodden path, but it's remarkable how few of the lessons are actually translated across boundaries to others in this process. And one of the key lessons is that countries generally reform after periods of crisis. They recover their economies, they diversify their economies after crisis. Vietnam, for example, tremendous crisis in the mid-1980s, which led to their process of renovation, or doi moi, and from that came the Vietnam that we know today, 25 years later. Colombia, by its own admission, at the turn of this century, was a failed state. It lost control of the majority of the 1,100 municipalities around Colombia. Today, 15 years later, it shows us how much can be achieved in a very short space of time. It should give tremendous heart to African countries that face real problems of security, particularly in the rural areas, and how to turn that situation around and to have a high growth, economic growth environment at the same time. There are very many good lessons, but the real critical one is here is have a good crisis. Use the crisis as an opportunity to change things for the better. Put policies in place which you perhaps couldn't do in normal political circumstances, but the crisis makes a kind of game-changing direction possible. And across the spectrum of countries, from the extreme sort of insecure elements to those that are trying to recover and diversify their economies, including South Africa's, to have a good crisis is absolutely important. And then finally, I would just say that in all of this, you've got to implement realistic policies. There's no point in trying to institute policies for a black and white TV age when we're living in a digital color one. You can't try the protectionist, isolationist route. It's like claiming that it's dark outside when you pull the blinds closed. It's not like that. You need to implement policies which are suitable for the country, but also suitable for the era in which we live. And in particular for Africa, it's short-term. It's expedient in the short term to implement sort of isolationist, mercantilist type policies. But in the longer term, given that 97% of the world's economy lives outside of Africa, we have to find a way to engage to our benefit, enabling the sort of diversification and recovery to take place that we seek.
Which are some of the states that have made remarkable recoveries, and what can we learn from these states?
No, recovery comes in remarkable shapes and forms. I mean, there's our own country, South Africa, which has a tremendous conflict resolution, I think, experience, which we can share with others. We do try and export it perhaps a bit too much to places like Israel and the Middle East at the moment. We'd always try and look for parallels, but it is a remarkable experience. And one of the things I did in this book was I've interviewed more than 12 heads of state, and they've shared their experiences in particular situations in conditions of state fragility or recovery, and included among them is F.W. de Klerk. And what I was particularly interested in is understanding the role of outsiders and insiders in manufacturing this process, and the role of external pressure in pushing people to the negotiating table, and the role of timing and method and leadership in this process. And it's absolutely clear that this was very key in the South African success story. Somaliland is another example. You don't really expect to hear about a successful conflict resolution development experience coming out of this barren, dry, dusty territory in the northern part of Somalia, which really was isolated by the Somalis themselves during the single Somali state, and then broke away in the early 1990s and developed themselves a homegrown form of political solution, which was without international assistance. There were no five-star hotels, there was no Sun City, there were no per diems. It really was developed locally by the Somalilanders themselves, and that's why that solution has stuck. It's a dirt poor place with very little going for it other than some livestock exports to the Gulf. But nonetheless, the political solution is stuck because they all bought into it and they were all there at the ground level. Colombia is another success story, a country which was in the grips of a drug-fueled insurgency in the 1990s, where government didn't extend authority to more than 75% of the country. And nonetheless, it's turned that situation around very quickly. Vietnam, Singapore, these are all good success stories in terms of diversification, recovery from what seemed like desperate circumstances. And then closer to home, a country like Mozambique, we often forget. 20 years ago, it had its first democratic election, also in 1994, and recovered very quickly. It's had 20 years of nearly 10% growth. Now, the challenge that Mozambique has, of course, is not just growth, but is actually reducing poverty through growth. And they found it much more difficult in reducing the poverty numbers. More than half the population remains in conditions of poverty, despite the fact that they've had 20 years of continuous growth. And in fact, that's one of, I think, the biggest challenges that I hope emerges in this book, is that unless we grip these problems now in Africa, they're going to get much bigger over the next generation. Today, sub-Saharan Africa's population is under 1 billion people, just under 1 billion people. By 2040, it'll be 2 billion people. By the turn of this century, it'll be 4 billion people at current rates of growth. Most of those people are going to be living in African cities. More than 50% of Africans are going to be living in urban environments within the next 15 years. We really have to act now to put in place the conditions for social stability, for development, for governance, that people can see a different, better future for themselves, which is stable, where they can work towards something, where there are not just articulated visions and goals and pieces of paper, but they mean something in operational terms. Those are some of the lessons we can take from others in this regard.
What lessons can South Africa specifically draw from your research into state failure and state recovery?
I think the critical lesson for South Africa is that there's no rocket science involved. At the end of the day, it's all about political will. It's about leadership at every level. We have a tendency to always go, oh, it's about the political leadership. Really, this is about leadership all the way down the food chain. It's about business playing its part. It's about engaging with government and civil society. It's about, of course, government having the right sets of leadership. It's about unions having responsibility to their employers as much as they have to their members, because without the employers, there are no members. One of the lessons that Singapore learnt in the mid-1960s, if you break the institutions that employ you, ultimately there's nothing to go around, and they develop their own solution as a result of that. We have to learn to say there's no rocket science involved. Many others have trodden this path before us, and we need to have a good crisis. We need fundamentally to put things in place now that we're going to reap dividends over the long term. There's always a tendency, particularly in a very vibrant democracy such as our own, to genuflect to the short term, to take the short term politically expedient solution. to say we have a plan but never implement it, never do the hard stuff, to resort to mercantilism, to protectionism, to isolationism, to cut ourselves off from the rest of the world and not do the really tough, make the really tough decisions, do the really hard things in transforming our society and creating the jobs that we crave. And I think that's the lesson out of all of this. We know what to do. We just need the plan to be able to do it and the large dollop of political will that goes with that.
That was Greg Mills from the Brent Foundation discussing his latest book, Why States Recover.